Hi everyone, this is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and this lecture video is titled Genetics, Epigenetics, and Addiction. This is just an introduction video to help you understand a little bit about what was in your reading and how genetics and epigenetics relates to addiction and recovery. So let's first look at genes, which was discussed briefly in your reading. Genes contribute to but are not responsible for behavior. So what this basically means is that our genes influence certain things, but they don't actually cause certain things. So for example, they might influence us to have specific disorders or diseases, but they don't actually cause it. And we talk a little bit about this when it comes to how environment triggers genetics. And what genes are basically DNA. So the basic structure that is made up of DNA is made up of 4 different nucleotides, and DNA stays within the cell nucleus. These nucleotides are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Humans do have 23 pairs of very long strands of DNA. However, only some DNA code for genetics. Most actually don't. And there's still some research going on what those other things that don't code for genetics are doing. Most cells are identical until they are told through the DNA transcription and translation process what are they and what are they supposed to do. So the DNA tells the genes what they are and what they are supposed to do through a transcription process. And transcription is the production of ribonucleic acid, or RNA, from the DNA strand. RNA is produced in the cell nucleus just like DNA. However, DNA has to stay in the cell nucleus, and RNA can actually go out of the cell nucleus to tell the other neurotransmitters and body what they are and what they're doing. They carry information through a translation to the ribosomes within the cell. Ribosomes play an important role in the production of proteins, and these proteins influence cell type and functioning of that cell. So basically, DNA makes RNA, and RNA makes protein. And we are basically a big batch of protein. Another important thing to look at is genome. This is a complete set of genes or genetic material that is present within a cell or organism. As you can see in this little box, there's a bunch of nucleotides, adenine, guanine, tyrosine, in different sequences and patterns. And so basically, geneticists can look at these sequencing of patterns and they're able to see any variations or analyze to see what's going on within the genetics. And something that's really interesting is we can actually look at a genome, a sequencing of genes, and for individuals who might have like a mental health disorder, like major depression, what psychiatrists have done for decades is they have just thrown different medications to kind of see what works. And by looking at a genome, we can actually test specific drugs to identify which drugs work best with your genetics. So, for example, if you have major depression, geneticists can do a blood test and identify, oh, Lexapro actually works the best with these genetics. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of insurances don't pay for this genetic testing. However, you can pay for it out of pocket and be able to kind of identify which drugs work best for specific disorders. And in the future, we hope to maybe analyze somebody's genome and prescribe that medication that will be easily metabolized within their blood. Polymorphism is the presence of genetic variation within a specific population. This helps us kind of understand this like natural selection and how we can operate. So basically, it's we are able to look at these polymorphisms and see variations within the genome that kind of create things in the long term, like evolution. But also polymorphism can kind of show the potential for specific diseases. So why is this important for addiction? Well, genetics of addiction can show us maybe susceptibility or versus inevitability within addiction. Genetic susceptibility affects the way the body responds to drugs. It is not fate. So if you have a specific genetic that might show that you have a more likelihood for susceptibility for addiction, that doesn't mean you will actually have an addiction. A set of genetic polymorphism can make abstinence difficult, and others can make it hard to become an addict. So we might have specific polymorphism that makes your genetics make abstinence more difficult, and in others, it can make becoming an addict more difficult. Some polymorphisms are linked to addiction. Specifically alcohol abuse and ALDH2 gene and alcohol and the ADH gene. Cocaine, alcohol, and nicotine and opiates come from one allele type, which is of dopamine and 2 receptor gene, the TAQLA minor or A1. Basically, it's a big long name for these specific allele genes. But we have been able, geneticists have been able to identify those specific genes and how they can be linked to potential alcohol, cocaine, and nicotine addiction. And the way they do this is from a genome-wide association study, or a GWAS. A GWAS pools a bunch of genetics and genomes to kind of identify these polymorphisms that might lead to addiction. They can identify genetic markers for disease, behavioral differences, and mental illnesses. Basically, it's just like 23andMe. We're collecting a bunch of 23andMe or Ancestry.com to kind of combine this GWAS study. The studies of genomes compare the DNA between people and can actually compare the entire genome in a group of people with addiction and those without. And they've been able to identify these genes of addiction and have been widely studied in mice. But again, it's super important to remember that genes and the environment play a role together. That is why we have consistently had this nature versus nurture debate. So what's important is there's heritability and environmental factors, and both can be untangled. The experience of genetic siblings with environmental siblings, so those siblings that are blood related versus those siblings who are not blood related but have lived in the same home. Another example of this is using twin studies. And basically what we have found is there is a greater environmental difference and less genetic contributions to behavior. This leads us to epigenetics. So genetics is the study of genes. Well, epigenetics goes beyond the limitations of genetics. The full picture of human DNA it shows how genes can be altered by external factors like environment, but it does not actually change the DNA, these external factors. It's kind of like a light switch. It can turn the gene on or off. So epigenetics plays this significant role in fine-tuning gene expression. And gene expression is the process by which the possession of a gene leads to the appearance of a phenotype of a corresponding character. Epigenome is a multitude of chemical compounds that can tell the genome what to do. An example of this is an epigenome can tell the genome to stretch out in order to make a copy of the RNA more easily. A histone, a multitude of chemical compounds that can tell the genome what to do. This works like a switch, turning certain parts of the DNA on and off, using DNA methylation and histone modifications to determine which genes are silenced or active. In fact, epigenetics can show that a person may be more susceptible to relapse even when fully aware of their negative consequences, depending on the frequency of these strong substances that alter gene expression and how their DNA is shaped in the reward centers of their brain. So I know this is a lot of biology and science, and that's not what you're here for, but as you read over the readings and watch the lectures, I want you to consider, how does genome and polymorphism play a part in addiction? And based on genetics, why are some individuals more susceptible to addiction? How does genetics and environment interact together to determine addiction? What is the difference between genetics and epigenetics? Thank you and have a great day.